Rescued German Shepherd refuses to eat for weeks until one elderly man walks in. Some animals bark for help. Some cry. Some growl. Some even lash out. That's how people know they're in pain. Something to fix, a wound to treat, a fear to calm. But then there are the ones who don't do any of that. The ones who just stop at Maple Ridge Animal Shelter. Tucked off the edge of a quiet two-lane road in northern Arizona, Kennel 14 held such a case. A German Shepherd, 3 or maybe 4 years old, found collapsed in a dry creek bed just outside of town. When animal control brought him in, he didn't resist, didn't look at anyone. He just lay there, ribs sharp under matted fur, breathing like it hurt. They called him Major. It wasn't his name, of course. No collar, no tags, no chip that worked properly. Only a half-functioning microtransponder that vaguely identified him as a former working dog. A K-9 unit, military or border patrol, no one could say for certain. The records were scrambled, incomplete, but there were signs. A weather-worn tactical harness fused his side with old wounds, scarred for along the neck, and a way of lying still that didn't seem like fear. It seemed like duty, or what was left of it. He doesn't flinch, said Dr. Layton, the shelter's head vet. He doesn't panic. He doesn't even look at us when we clean his wounds. He just lets it happen. The first 3 days, Major refused to eat. They tried everything. Soft chicken, hand-fed bites of ground beef, even peanut butter on a spoon. Nothing. He sniffed once or twice, then turned his head away, eyes dull. He's not afraid. The vet said quietly to one of the techs. He's grieving. Grieving. No one argued. By day 5, staff had stopped trying to coax him. By day 8, they no longer said things like, maybe tomorrow. Instead, they moved quietly around his kennel, whispering to one another, watching, waiting. Major stayed curled in the same corner, his large body pressed tightly against the wall, facing away from the bars. His ears didn't twitch when people passed. His tail didn't move. His water bowl remained half full for days. The security camera caught him standing only once at 3:14 a.m., when the building was silent and dark. He paced in a tight, anxious circle, then returned to his spot, sinking down again as if the ground had claimed him. I've seen dogs give up before, said Mia, one of the shelter techs. Her voice hushed over her lunch break. But not like this. This one is like he doesn't even want the world to see him go. That week, the shelter had 22 dogs. 11 had already made the euthanasia list. Not for behavior, but for lack of space and lack of time. The pandemic surge of surrendered animals hadn't slowed, and rural shelters like Maple Ridge were always the last to receive attention or funding. But no one put Major on the list. Not yet. There's something in his eyes, said Kelsey, the behaviorist who had tried 3 times to sit with him, like he's stuck in a place we can't reach. And no one's even trying to get him out. The building itself wasn't much. Concrete floors, chain-link doors, a hum of fluorescent lights that flickered sometimes when it rained. But it was clean. The volunteers worked hard. Blankets were rotated. Toys were given. Soothing music played at low volume during feeding hours. And still, in Kennel 14, Major lay silent. Twice a day, Kelsey made a point to sit outside his kennel, never facing him directly, never speaking unless her voice was gentle and slow. She read from paperback books. She sat cross-legged. Once, she laid a stuffed toy near the bars. He didn't touch it, didn't look. The silence around him deepened with each passing day. It was during one of those quiet afternoons, when Kelsey was packing up her things, that Dr. Layton paused near the kennel and asked a question she rarely voiced aloud. Do you think maybe he belonged to someone who didn't come back? Kelsey looked over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. Or maybe, she said slowly, he was the one who didn't come back in time. They didn't talk more about it. There wasn't anything to say. There's a kind of mourning that doesn't howl. It just folds itself up into a corner and waits for the rest of the world to forget it ever existed. Major, the nameless shepherd, was disappearing by inches. And then, on a Tuesday morning in late March, the shelter door opened with the soft jingle of the old brass bell, a bell that had hung there since before Mia was born. It rang differently depending on the person, with energy for volunteers, with clatter for children, with haste for city workers dropping strays. This time it rang low, unhurried. The man who stepped inside didn't speak right away. He wore an old brown coat, the collar faded and worn. His boots were clean but cracked at the edges. His face bore the lines of sun and time, and his white hair was combed neatly, though he didn't seem to notice when the wind ruffled it on the way in. Walt Henley. He walked with a slight lean, not from weakness, but from age, the kind that teaches your feet to move cautiously, as though the ground might not always keep its promise. "I brought some things," he said, setting down 2 boxes near the front desk. "Blankets, some shirts. My wife used to." He stopped, cleared his throat. "My wife used to collect stuff for places like this. I figured I should keep it going." Mia nodded, offering a smile. She didn't push, didn't ask questions, but Walt lingered, his eyes drifting down the hallway that led to the kennels. "Mind if I take a look around?" "Of course," she said. They liked the company. He moved slowly down the corridor, hands in his coat pockets, eyes sweeping from one kennel to the next. A young beagle barked at him excitedly. A mutt with one eye wagged her tail, so hard her hips swayed. He paused a few times, nodded at the dogs as if greeting old acquaintances. Then he reached Kennel 14, and stopped. He didn't call out, didn't crouch, didn't clap or click his tongue. He just stood there. Inside the kennel, Major didn't move. Not right away. Not much. But something shifted. Walt lowered himself onto the bench across the way, wincing a little at the effort. He sat in silence. Outside, the wind passed over the roof in long, low sighs. Inside, the dogs quieted, one by one. Major's ears twitched. And after 22 days of utter stillness, the shepherd turned his head, just a little, just enough, and looked at the man, not begging, not hoping, just aware, as if some part of him had been waiting for this particular presence, this particular silence. Not noise, not kindness, not food, just someone whose brokenness fit beside his own. The man sat there for a long time, not speaking, not shifting, just breathing in quiet rhythm with the still air that hung over Kennel 14 like a veil. Major didn't move again. He didn't approach, didn't bark, didn't so much as flick his tail. But he didn't turn away either. That in itself was new. There's a kind of attention that isn't about alertness, not the kind born from instinct or training. This was something slower, older, recognition not of face, but of silence. Pain recognizes pain. Stillness knows its own kind. Walt Henley didn't know why he had walked to the back of the shelter. He hadn't planned to. The boxes of blankets had been enough. A simple errand, a nod to the past. A gesture towards something his wife June might have done. She'd always been the giver. Every year after the holidays, she'd clean out the closets and gather up what she called the soft things. Extra towels, old sweaters, anything that still carried warmth. "Somebody," she would say, folding the fabric with careful hands, "needs this more than we do." Even after the cancer came, even when she was too tired to stand for long, she'd direct him from the kitchen chair while he carried boxes to the truck. That one's for the shelter. Don't forget the flannel set. He hadn't donated anything since she died. 3 months. 92 days, to be exact. Not that he was counting. Not out loud. The house had gone quiet in ways he couldn't explain. It wasn't just the absence of footsteps or her voice humming in the next room. It was a shift in the air. The hollowness that settled into the corners. The echo in the hallway at night when he got up to use the bathroom and forgot, for a heartbeat, that she wasn't asleep in the bed anymore. He'd stopped turning on the porch light, stopped watering the plants, even stopped opening the curtains in the morning. A neighbor had left a note, just once, tucked under a magnet on the front door. "Thinking of you. Let us know if you need anything." He didn't reply. People meant well. But what could they offer him that wasn't already gone? The radio was the only thing he'd turn on anymore. Not for music, just the talk shows. He needed to hear voices sometimes. Any voices. On that Tuesday morning, he'd gone into the garage for a screwdriver and ended up staring at the stack of moving boxes June had labeled, "Donate, Winter." He hadn't had the heart to touch them, but he'd opened one, then another, folded shirts she used to wear around the house, blankets she'd mended with patches of blue and rust. He couldn't throw them away, but he couldn't keep them either. So he drove to the shelter, and somehow his feet had brought him here, to this moment, to this dog, this soldier, this ghost. Major didn't look like the dogs Walt had known growing up. He wasn't soft around the edges. His face was angular, fur coarse and dulled by dust. One ear sat slightly off-center from an old injury. A long scar across his right front leg, the fur around it twisted in unnatural patterns. Walt studied him from across the kennel bars, not with curiosity, but with something else. Something older, like he was looking at a photograph he'd forgotten he'd taken, blurry, faded, but familiar. His back ached from the bench. His knees didn't enjoy long sitting anymore. But he didn't move, didn't want to, and Major, for whatever reason, didn't turn away. Later, the staff would say it was coincidence, that maybe the timing of Walt's visit just happened to align with the moment Major started to turn a corner. But Kelsey, the shelter's behaviorist, would later admit, he didn't look at any of us like that, not even close. It was like he saw something in him. Walt didn't know it then, but that look, that first silent glance, was the beginning of something neither of them expected. He came back the next day. He didn't tell anyone, didn't explain why. He simply showed up around the same time, walked the corridor slowly, and sat again. This time, he brought a chair from home, an old aluminum folding one with green plastic webbing. The kind they used to take to 4th of July fireworks, back when the grandkids still came around. He set it down, opened a brown paper bag, and pulled out a small Tupperware of boiled chicken, the way June used to make it when their old terrier had a bad stomach. He didn't offer it through the bars. He just placed it gently on the ground, far enough away to give space. Then he sat. Major didn't move, but his ears were angled forward, his breathing slower. There were no words, no whistles, just two beings occupying the same quiet. A man who had stopped speaking to the world, and a dog who had stopped trusting it. On the third day, it rained. Not hard, just a soft desert drizzle that washed the dust from the roof and turned the air earthy. Walt came anyway, this time in a thicker coat, the same chair under his arm. He sat like always, the sound of the rain tapping gently on the windows above. And Major blinked. That's it, a single, long blink as he watched the man outside his kennel. On the fourth day, Walt shifted his chair slightly closer. Still, he didn't reach out. Still, he didn't speak. He didn't need to. By the fifth visit, staff began to notice something different. Major wasn't lying against the wall as often. He would sit now, not for long, but upright, watching the man's approach. His ears perked slightly when the old bell rang out front. By the sixth visit, he was standing at the far end of the kennel when Walt arrived. He didn't move forward, but he was watching, present, alive, and Walt. Well, Walt started turning on his porch light again. He swept the back steps. He opened the curtains that faced the east, the ones that caught the sun first. He didn't tell anyone what was changing, but something was, something shared, as if, piece by piece, a fracture inside him was lining up, not closing, not yet, but aligning, because for the first time in 92 days, he wasn't sitting in silence alone. He was sharing it, and that was enough. That was a beginning. The next time Walt came to the shelter, no one stopped to ask him why. It had become clear, without needing explanation, that something quiet and unspoken had started between the old man and the German shepherd in Kennel 14. The staff didn't interfere. There was no protocol for it, and no one wanted to interrupt whatever this was. He brought the same green folding chair, scuffed at the edges, paint flaking just slightly around the rivets. The kind of chair people associate with old fishing trips, little league games, or long afternoons in a backyard no one tends anymore. Walt carried it with care. Not reverence, just familiarity, like it had been waiting for him to use it again. He sat in front of the kennel and set down a small Tupperware container. No fanfare, no coaxing, just soft-boiled chicken, the way June always made it. Shredded gently, no seasoning, warm enough to carry scent but cool enough to eat. He placed it a foot from the bars. Still distant. Still respectful. And then he sat. That was it. He didn't speak. Didn't whistle. Didn't tap on the bars or call the dog's name. Not even the one the staff had given him. Major. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, pulled his jacket tighter across his shoulders, and stared ahead. Not quite the dog, but not entirely away either. They sat like that for nearly an hour. Major didn't move, but he didn't turn away either. He kept his gaze soft but steady. He watched the man's hands, how they folded over each other, idle and loose. He listened to the sound of his breath, slow and even like wind over pine. It was nothing. It was everything. Walt returned the next morning, and the one after that. He began to wear a cap. Old, faded navy blue, the kind with frayed stitching across the brim. On the front, a patch barely visible now read, U.S. Army Logistics Division. He never talked about it, never needed to. By the end of the week, the dogs in surrounding kennels began to recognize him. They would lift their heads when the bell rang out front. Some barked, some wagged, some pressed their noses to the bars. But Walt didn't stop for them. He walked straight to Kennel 14 and sat. Each visit was the same. Chair, chicken, silence. He began bringing a thermos of coffee. Sometimes he'd sip from it slowly, rubbing his thumb over the seam of the cup. Sometimes he'd reach into his coat and pull out a tiny notebook, flipping it open without reading, just holding it, as if to remind himself that something still mattered enough to be written down. Once, Kelsey stood in the hallway a few kennels down and just watched. It was like looking at two survivors across enemy lines, neither crossing the boundary, neither retreating, just watching, waiting, and perhaps healing. Major's posture began to change, not in sudden ways. There was no magical transformation, but the weight in his body shifted. He sat upright more often. He stretched in the mornings, arching his back and lifting his tail. Small things, barely noticeable, but Walt noticed, and that was enough. On the 8th day, something unusual happened. The chicken was gone, not while Walt was watching. Major never ate in front of anyone, but sometime between Walt's departure and the evening cleaning round, the food had disappeared. No crumbs, no scattered pieces, just a clean plastic container, licked down to the curve. It wasn't much, but for a dog who hadn't willingly eaten in 3 weeks, it was something close to a miracle. Dr. Layton called it a milestone. Walt just called it Wednesday. He didn't bring it up, didn't comment when Kelsey mentioned the empty dish. He only gave a half smile and returned the next morning with another portion, this time tucked neatly into a cloth napkin, like it was part of a ritual. By the 10th day, Walt was speaking again, not to Major, not directly, but he began to murmur things, little half-thoughts, fragments of sentences meant more for himself than anyone else. Rain's coming later, he'd say, looking at the gray sheen in the sky beyond the high windows. Or, that left knee's worse in the mornings. Ought to finally get it looked at. Sometimes, he'd hum under his breath. Soft tunes. Old ballads. A verse of something almost remembered from long ago. Major didn't react, but he didn't recoil either. He stayed near. He listened. Once, around day 12, Walt fell asleep in the chair. Not deeply. Just a slow doze, chin against chest, breath quiet. When Mia walked by and caught sight of them, she stopped short. Major was lying at the edge of the kennel, just behind the bars, not pressed into the far corner like before, not hiding. He was facing Walt, eyes open, still, like a sentinel keeping watch. And when Walt stirred, slowly, gently, blinking back into the dim light, Major didn't retreat. He stayed. They stayed. That was the rhythm of it. No breakthroughs, no commands, no leashes or treats or training techniques, just presence, just time. Sometimes Walt brought books. He didn't read them out loud, but he held them open in his lap, occasionally tracing a line with his finger. Other days, he'd come without anything at all, just himself and the slow shuffle of his boots down the corridor. People started to notice something else too. Walt looked different. Nothing dramatic. He still wore the same coat, still moved like a man whose joints ached in the cold. But his eyes had changed. He looked less sunken, more present, as if, by being seen by this dog, even silently, he had started to see himself again. One evening, after the last shift had ended, Kelsey lingered by the observation monitor. The screen showed the night camera feed, grainy in black and white. Most dogs were curled into their corners or nests of blankets. But in Kennel 14, Major was sitting upright, eyes fixed toward the empty space just beyond the bars. He stayed that way for 20 minutes, like he was waiting for morning, like he knew the man would come back. It was the 14th morning. The bell over the shelter's front door chimed at precisely 8:37 a.m., not from intention, just from habit. Walt had started arriving around the same time every day, enough that the dogs knew his rhythm, enough that Mia always had coffee ready, black, 2 sugars, though he never asked for it. Spring had begun to bloom in the desert. You would know it at a glance. Not here, not with all the concrete and metal fences and fluorescent lighting. But the air had changed. It smelled less of dust and more of sun-warmed stone. And the wind came lighter, carried with a kind of hush that made people think of something turning. Not over, but forward. Walt walked down the kennel corridor slowly, the green folding chair tucked under his arm. He wore his cap today, tilted forward over his brow, and the hem of his coat carried a faint trace of lavender, from the sachets June used to tuck into their dresser drawers. He stopped at Kennel 14. Major was already up. He'd begun doing that, rising when he heard Walt's footsteps. He didn't bark, didn't approach the bars, but he stood, watched, and waited. Walt unfolded the chair, eased himself into it with the usual wince, and rested both hands on the knob of the cane he now brought with him. His knees had begun to speak louder these days. The walk from the parking lot to Major's kennel seemed longer than it had the week before. Still, he came. Always he came. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small napkin-wrapped parcel. Chicken, as usual. But today, he didn't set it down right away. He held it a moment longer in his lap, as if unsure, and then, with a quiet grunt, he shifted slightly. Something in his balance slipped. The cane fell. It clattered to the ground in a sharp, sudden sound, wood against concrete, echoing down the empty hallway like a bell breaking the hush. Walt froze. His first thought wasn't about the pain in his back or the awkwardness of bending down to pick it up. It was about Major. Loud noises could be dangerous in shelters. They could undo progress, send nervous dogs spiraling backward. Startle responses could snap like rubber bands, sudden, uncontrollable, full of fight or flight. But Major didn't flinch. He didn't bolt to the corner like he used to. He didn't drop to the floor or tremble. Instead, he stepped forward, 2 slow, deliberate steps toward the bars. His ears stood alert, and his head lowered slightly as he sniffed the air. Then, with a stillness that felt deliberate, he sat down, not far from where the cane had landed. Walt didn't breathe for a second. He watched as Major leaned his head forward, nostrils working, eyes locked on the cane. Then, and only then, the shepherd did something no one had seen before. He let out a soft, almost inaudible whine. Just one note. Low. Wounded. Remembered. Walt blinked. Heart caught somewhere in his throat. He bent slowly, not to pick up the cane just yet, but to look closer. Major's eyes didn't meet his. But they weren't shut down either. They were searching, tracing, as if the object on the floor meant something, as if it reminded him of something once familiar, a routine, a rhythm, a figure from the past. A man with a cane, a handler who limped, a scent that lingered on polished wood and old sweat and wore dust. Walt didn't speak, but inside him, something trembled. A wire-long rusted flickered with faint current. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the only one. Major lowered his head further, resting it gently on his front paws, gazed still on the cane. He didn't touch it, didn't growl or nudge or whimper again. He just lay there, guarding it, like he understood it mattered, like he'd once known how to protect something like it. Walt finally reached forward and picked it up. His hand brushed the concrete, fingers closing around the smooth wood. It felt warmer than expected, alive with meaning. He said it beside him. Major's gaze followed it the whole way. Kelsey saw it from down the corridor. She hadn't intended to interrupt. She often checked in from a distance, careful not to impose on whatever strange understanding was blooming between the two. But this was different. She approached slowly, her footsteps soft. "Everything okay?" she asked gently. Walt nodded, not looking up. There was something in his voice when he replied, something rough around the edges, like gravel that had been washed in rain. "Drop the cane," he murmured. He didn't run. Kelsey crouched just enough to peer into the kennel. Major hadn't moved, but his body was loose. Relaxed, the air in the space had changed. He walked toward it, Walt added. Didn't growl, didn't hide. Kelsey glanced at the cane, then at the dog, then back at the old man. "That's not nothing," she said. Walt offered the ghost of a smile. "No, it's not." There was silence between them, a gentle one. Then Walt spoke again, almost himself. "Used to know a dog like that," he said, "back in the late 70s. Wasn't mine. Belonged to a friend. Trained to respond to cues. Used to follow his limp like a shadow. Wouldn't go anywhere unless he heard that tap-tap of the cane." Kelsey didn't answer. She didn't need to. Some moments don't ask for conversation, only company. The day passed slowly. Warm light filtered through the high windows. The smell of spring desert drifted in through a cracked vent, minerals and wind and something faintly sweet. And when Walt stood to leave, Major didn't retreat. He remained where he was, watching, silent, steady, as if some corner of his mind had turned. Not completely. Not enough to name what he'd remembered, but enough to know he'd remembered something. Enough to stay present. Enough to hope. It happened on the 17th morning. The sky outside Maple Ridge Animal Shelter had turned that soft, endless gray of early spring. Not quite cold, not quite warm, with a hush in the air that made even the trees seem to pause mid-breath. It was a kind of morning where everything felt half awake, including the man who parked his truck in the back lot, stepped out with a quiet grunt, and walked the familiar path toward Kennel 14. Walt moved a little slower that day. His joints weren't cooperating. The ache in his hip had sharpened overnight, and his sleep had been fractured by a dream he couldn't quite recall. Something about wind and footsteps on gravel, and a voice he hadn't heard in years. He rubbed at his temple as he walked, like he could press the pieces back into focus. The green chair was already waiting by the kennel. Mia had started setting it up for him each morning. No one asked why. It had simply become part of the routine, like cleaning bowls, like turning on the lights, like checking the list of adoptable dogs that, for some reason, never included the name Major. Walt settled into the chair with a quiet exhale, his breath fogging faintly in the morning chill. Major stood at the back of the kennel, watching. He didn't come forward, but he didn't hide either. Walt reached into the brown paper bag he'd brought and pulled out a small sandwich-sized container. Inside was chicken again, gently cooked and torn into small, careful shreds. This time, though, he'd added something else, just a touch of soft rice. June used to call it comfort food for souls that forgot how to chew. He opened the lid and set the container on the concrete just outside the kennel bars, close enough to be visible, far enough to not intrude. Then he sat back, quiet, hands folded, waiting. Major sniffed the air, not dramatically, not like a dog eager for a treat, but with something smaller, more cautious, like a man opening a window to a room he hadn't entered in years. Walt didn't look directly at him. He never did. That was part of their agreement, their silent rhythm. No pressure, no expectation, just presence. He pulled the cloth from his pocket, a faded handkerchief that had been in his coat for as long as he could remember, and began folding on his lap, smoothing the corners. A habit, a quiet meditation. Then, without sound or ceremony, Major stepped forward. One paw, then the other. Each step was slow, deliberate, measured. He moved like someone who wasn't sure if the ground would hold, like he remembered too well the times it hadn't. When he reached the bars, he paused. His eyes flicked toward a container, then back to Walt, then down again. And then, slowly, carefully, he lowered his head and took the first bite. It was not a gulp. It was not hunger. It was something else entirely. A decision. A return. Walt didn't move, but inside him, something clenched deep in the ribs behind the sternum, where grief lives when it no longer knows what to do with itself. He wanted to say something, wanted to mark the moment, but he stayed still. Major chewed quietly, swallowed, took another piece, then another. By the time the container was half empty, he was sitting down to eat, relaxed in a way that made his shoulders look broader, his frame less folded in on itself. And then, impossibly, he let out a sound. A low, steady huff. Not a bark, not a whine. Just breath. Walt nodded once. He didn't speak, but his hands stopped folding the handkerchief. Kelsey came by about 20 minutes later. She was doing her usual rounds, clipboard in hand, when she stopped cold just outside Kennel 14. Major was sitting near the bars. The food container was empty. Walt looked up at her and raised an eyebrow, a soft humor behind his eyes. "Well," he said, his voice rough from disuse, "guess he likes rice." Kelsey stared for a moment, then crouched low, keeping her distance. Major looked at her, didn't back away, but he didn't move closer either. He'd already chosen his person for the day, and that was enough. "You fed him by hand?" she asked. Walt shook his head. "He came to on his own." She blinked, surprised. "He didn't flinch when I sat down," Walt added. "Didn't tuck his tail. Just walked up and took what he needed." Kelsey scribbled something on her notepad, but didn't look down. She was watching Major, the line of his back, the relaxed set of his jaw, the calm in his chest. "He's grounding again," she said. "He's remembering how to be in his body." Walt nodded slowly. "Feels like that's what I've been trying to do, too." The word surprised even him. They hung in the air between them, honest, weighty, soft. Kelsey didn't push. Sometimes healing is just that, sitting beside someone who names the ache and not trying to fix it. That night, the shelter staff gathered for their weekly meeting. Normally, it was a fast, functional thing. Updates, scheduling, medical notes. But that evening, someone brought up Major. They watched the camera footage in silence. The grainy black and white clip of the shepherd walking toward the food container and eating without fear. And one by one, the room filled with breath. Not laughter, not applause. Just the quiet sound of people witnessing something sacred. Something rare. Something true. Back at home, Walt poured himself a second cup of tea for the first time in weeks. He didn't turn on the radio. Instead, he left the porch light on. Not for anyone in particular. Just because. And when he finally went to bed, he left the bedroom door slightly ajar. Out of habit. Out of hope. Because maybe, just maybe, some spaces were meant to be filled again. Not all at once, but one careful bite at a time. The adoption paperwork didn't take long. By the time Walt reached the front desk with the filled-out form in his hand, no one looked surprised. Not Mia, who had already printed the documents. Not Kelsey, who had quietly updated Major's profile in the database that morning from rescue hold to adopted pending pickup. Even Dr. Layton, who usually maintained a strict professional distance from the shelter animals, paused long enough to write, "Remarkable emotional response to adopter. Recommend release with follow-up support," in Major's file. She underlined it twice. Walt signed the last page slowly, his pen deliberate. His handwriting wasn't what it used to be. Letters curled differently now, slightly uneven, shaky on the right side, but the signature was still his. The receptionist slid the paperwork into a manila folder and looked up. "You're really doing this," she said softly. Walt didn't smile, but he nodded. "Feels like the only thing this old house has been waiting on." That afternoon, they opened the kennel gate. No leashes, no pressure. Just a door quietly unlatched. Walt didn't go in. He stood a few feet back, the same way he'd done every morning. Hands in his pockets, eyes level with the dog he'd come to know. Major looked at the open gate, then at Walt, then stepped forward. One paw, then another. He walked out of the kennel like he'd walked out his own shadow. Not quickly, not with tail-wagging joy, but with purpose, with calm. He walked straight to Walt and stood beside him, shoulder to knee. Then he sat down. A pause. A quiet pact. When they opened the back door of Walt's truck, Major jumped in without being asked. He curled up across the back seat, his chin resting on the edge of the seat cushion, eyes fixed forward, as if he already knew the route, as if he'd been going home all along. The drive was short, 20 minutes on quiet roads, past fields beginning to green and old windmills turning slow in a breeze. Walt didn't turn on a radio. He didn't need to. The silence was full now, not empty. Back at the house, the one June had filled with curtains that caught the light just right. Walt parked by the porch and opened the passenger side door. He didn't speak, but Major jumped down, landing gently on the gravel, and stood there, ears pricked, nose in the wind. Walt opened the front door. "Come on," he murmured. The words moored himself into the dog, but Major followed, not hesitating, not sniffing every step, like he already knew the weight of this threshold, like the boards of the porch had whispered something familiar beneath his feet. Inside, the air smelled like lemon oil and old wood, the kind of scent houses get after years of being carefully tended, then quietly left to rest. Walt moved to the front hall, past the bookshelf with too many dust jackets, into the kitchen. Major trailed behind, pausing only once. At the end of the hallway, where a framed photograph sat slightly askew on a side table, a woman with silver-streaked hair, standing in a summer garden, a soft dog pressed to her leg. "June," Walt noticed. He paused, one hand on the kitchen doorframe, and turned to look. Major was staring at the photo. Not close, not touching it, just looking. "I think she would have liked you," Walt said quietly. He didn't expect an answer. But Major stepped forward and laid down at the threshold to the kitchen, like a guardian, like a dog remembering his post. Walt opened a cabinet under the sink and pulled out a clean bowl, ceramic, pale blue, with a chip on the edge from years ago. June had refused to throw it out. "Still holds water just fine," she'd said. He filled it, placed it near the door. Then, after a long pause, he added another, this one for food. The house, one set for one, now had 2 bowls again. Later that evening, as the sun lowered into the ridges beyond town, Walt sat on the porch with a blanket over his knees and a cup of decaf in his hand. Major lay beside the rocking chair, his body stretched long on the wooden slats, head resting on his paws. Neither of them moved much, but the stillness no longer ached. It hummed. Somewhere in the distance, a wind chime rang, low and silver. Walt sipped his coffee and looked out across the backyard, where the grass had started to reach again through last season's frostbite. "We'll get it back in shape," he murmured, as much to himself as to the dog. Major didn't move, but his ears flicked once. Listening, that night, for the first time in months, Walt didn't close the bedroom door. He left it open just a few inches, long enough for light to spill into the hallway, long enough for company, should it wish to come. And sometime around midnight, when the heater kicked on with a low hum, Major padded quietly into the room. He didn't climb onto the bed. He didn't beg or whine or scratch at the sheets. He simply lay down on the rug at the foot of the bed, turned 3 slow circles, and curled into himself with a sigh. A presence, a weight, a promise. Walt didn't speak, but he slept deeper than he had in months. In the morning, there were 2 shapes on the old hardwood floor. 2 bowls in the kitchen, 2 sets of footsteps in the hallway, and the house, once echoing with memory, now sounded like something else entirely. Not laughter, not music, just life, shared, quiet, and beginning again. The change, when it came, was quiet. There were no grand moments, no dramatic transformations, just small things, simple, ordinary things, that marked the beginning of a life lived in tandem rather than apart. The first time Major followed Walt out onto the backfield, without a leash, he didn't run. He didn't lag behind. He simply matched the pace of the old man's steps. Slow, measured, a rhythm they'd built together over mornings on the porch and afternoons in the fading light. They walked the length of the old path that edged the property. The one June had once lined with marigolds. Most had long since gone wild, swallowed by time and wind, but every now and then a stubborn bloom still rose in the dirt, bright and defiant. Walt didn't speak much on those walks. But Major was never far. When the weather warmed, they started walking the evenings, too, just to stretch the day a little longer, just to make space for the quiet to breathe between them. Neighbors began to notice, not all at once, but in bits and pieces. Someone saw the shepherd through the fence and asked if Walt had taken up fostering. He shook his head and said, "No, he's staying." Someone else brought over a bag of dog biscuits, homemade, wrapped in wax paper. Walt thanked her, awkwardly, and left the note she'd included on the counter for a week before finally pinning it to the fridge. "Glad to see you out walking again." Major wasn't the kind of dog to chase after balls or leap through sprinklers. He didn't bark when the mailman came. He didn't play tug or catch. But he stood beside Walt with a patience that felt ancient, as if he understood the weight of age, of injury, of memory. Once, when Walt stumbled on the back steps, just a moment, a misstep, a jar in the knee, Major stepped forward and leaned his shoulder into the man's thigh, steadying him. Neither said a word, but they both stood still for a long time after that. Inside the house, things found their place. The rug near the fireplace became Major's chosen corner. The chip blue water bowl remained under the window, refilled without ceremony each morning. A second leash hung next to Walt's coat by the door, though it was rarely used anymore. The radio came on more often now, not just talk shows, but music, old jazz records, a little country, once or twice, even gospel. One afternoon, Walt sat in the kitchen peeling apples, a habit he'd taken up again, and Major rested his chin on the windowsill, eyes tracking the slow sway of birds in the cottonwood outside. "You ever notice," Walt murmured, "how things come back in seasons?" Major didn't answer, but he didn't need to. They had become fluent in each other's silences. Kelsey came by once, a few weeks after the adoption, just to check in. She sat on the porch with Walt, while Major lay nearby, half asleep in the sun. "He looks different," she said, watching the shepherd's slow, steady breathing. Walt nodded. "Feels different, too." Kelsey tilted her head. "And you?" Walt didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out over the yard. The marigolds had started to bloom again, not in neat lines, but wild and crooked, reaching toward the light in their own way. "I think maybe I was waiting," he said softly, "for the noise in my head to quiet down, for the house to stop sounding like an echo." He turned toward her, and then he came and just filled the space without saying a word. Kelsey smiled. Sometimes the best ones do. They sat in silence a while longer. When she stood to leave, Major walked with her to the truck and stood watch as she drove off, then returned, unhurried, to his place beside the porch steps. Later that summer, Walt began tending the garden again, not the way June did. He didn't know which flowers like sun or how often to water the herbs, but he dug his fingers into the earth. He pulled weeds. He planted things he hoped might grow. Major was always close by, sometimes dozing in the shade, sometimes watching the gate. When the first tomatoes came in, Walt picked one and set it on the windowsill like an offering. It sat there for 3 days before he finally sliced it, shared it with toast, and set aside a bite of boiled egg for Major. There's a kind of healing that doesn't arrive with celebration. It doesn't show up with balloons or certificates or applause. It creeps in quietly, disguised as routine. A second cup of coffee, a longer walk, a door left open. Sometimes, healing looks like 2 bowls on the floor instead of 1, or a light turned on, not because you're afraid of the dark, but because you expect someone to come through it. 6 months after the adoption, a postcard arrived from the shelter, just a short note from Mia, written in her loopy cursive. "Still talking about you, too. Thanks for reminding us why we do this." Walt pinned it next to the old grocery list he never erased. Major barked once that evening, low, short, at the sound of a fox darting through the trees behind the house. Walt looked up from his chair and smiled. "Guess it's your yard now, too." That night, they walked the back path under a harvest moon. No flashlight, no leash, just the sound of soft footsteps, one pair heavy and slow, the other lighter but grounded. At the edge of the ridge, Walt stopped. Major stopped beside him. The land stretched out below, all shadow and silver, quiet and open. "I don't know how much time we got left," Walt said, not in sadness but in fact. He looked down at the dog beside him, hand resting lightly on his head. "But I figure we've got at least a little more." Major leaned into him, just slightly, like gravity itself agreed. They stood that way a while longer, not waiting, not searching. Just being. Two souls, once fractured, now walking the same road. Not back to what was, but forward. Together.